Salutations, service supply drivers. Automatic here for Automatic Games, bringing you yet another video in my Battlefield 1 series. This one, the second installment of Through Mud and Blood, where we're accompanying the tank crew of a Mark V called the Black Bess.
You have the look of the devil, Townsend.
Is that right?
All we got out here is blind orders and chance. Which will do for us first, you reckon?
I'm sick of your lip, McManus.
Aye, aye, sir.
Edward, start it up. Lines backing up.
Big Bess. Give us a break. Give us a break. Come on. Come on, Bess. Come on, stop. Stop, Big Bess. Stop. It stopped. Are you just gonna stand there? Hell. There's fog up ahead. I can't see more than 20 yards.
We're pushing through. Edwards, I'll drive. You jump out and scout ahead. Don't be a hero, man. Just do your job.
Let's all get through in one piece, eh? If you get into trouble, we'll be right behind you, lad.
Now, Edwards is instructed not to be a hero in this mission, but really that's exactly what he's expected to do. Serve as a one-man army. Now, the tank crew is actually short 2 men. Finch died, gunned down, while outside the tank about midway through the last episode, and at the end of the last episode, Pritchard was killed as Germans overtook the tank, and put their arms right through some of the hatches, inflicting small arms fire. Although our tank is in better shape than that one. That leaves McManus, the gunner, Townsend, the lead guitar player for The Who.
That's a field guns now. Edwards, have a recce up ahead. If there's a gun, you'll need to deal with it. If things go sour, we'll come in blast. Otherwise, we'll bring Bess up when you give the signal.
No, actually, Townsend is the tank commander. And, of course, Daniel Edwards, who, while not serving as tank driver, is kind of taking on a role reminiscent of Rambo or Solid Snake. Now, at the end of the episode, the last episode that is, I mentioned the scenes of intense fighting during the 1917 Battle of Cambrai. They were Flaquier, a village, and Bourlon Wood. Unbeknownst to me, the very next mission would in fact be a trek through Bourlon Wood. And I have a mixed reaction to this setting. Primarily because you don't see a single Canadian involved in this mission. Whereas in the 1918 Battle of Cambrai, Bourlon Wood was in fact captured by Canadian forces who fought valiantly for this sector. But here it's just Daniel Edwards and a shovel. And occasionally a Maxim. Now, I don't know how Townsend can hear the whistle above the din of this machine gun, but whatever. Anyhow, I do ultimately want to talk more about the 1917 Battle of Cambrai, specifically the fight over Bourlon. In fact, I'm kind of just getting into a book called With the Tanks, the memoirs of a British tank commander in the Great War. It's the memoirs of a man named William Watson, who was with G Company of the Tank Corps. And I've kind of skipped ahead in it because I'm nowhere near finished with the book. I'm not even a quarter of the way in. But I happened upon a quote that mentioned Bourlon, because of course he was involved in the first Battle of Cambrai. And so I want to share that quote with you. And I quote,
"Immediately in front of me on the hillside was the great dark mass of Bourlon Wood, square and impenetrable, covering the highest point of the hill and stretching over the skyline to the farthest slope, which we could not see. The wood dominated the whole countryside, and beyond it there was nothing but low open country, extending to the marshes of the Scarp. We could not live north of Havrincourt while the enemy still held the wood, and if we captured the wood, there was nothing to prevent us from sweeping northwards of the Scarp or westwards into Cambrai."
End quote. And if you could hear that well enough, he talks about how Bourlon was a dominant feature on the landscape. It was an elevated area, and as the battle progressed past November 20th, the forces that were kind of aiming toward Bourlon, which I believe would have been the 51st Division under Harper, they got held up at Flaquier village. In fact, in getting held up, and I mentioned that last time, the Germans managed to knock out a number of tanks. In one instance, this was one German officer that took over a 77, and for one officer, I don't know exactly, I can't remember exactly how many tanks he took out, and so I'm reluctant to just throw a number out there. But the one guy did plenty of damage until he was ultimately killed. But due to this holdup, among others, by the end of 48 hours into the battle, Bourlon was still occupied by the Germans, and that was no good. I mean, you couldn't really rest on your laurels as long as they held that high ground and could fire on the ground that you had successfully taken. So, when they got together, this is to say Haig and Byng, and they kind of appraised the situation, they decided we got to press forward. I mean, Surprise was gone. Half the tanks were out of action. The supply lines were starting to get kind of fragile, but nonetheless, they had just made the executive decision to press onward. And some people point to that decision as being one of the handicaps of the entire mission. Although Haig, in his memoirs, he constantly reinforces the fact that Bourlon was such a commanding position, you could not ignore that, and you couldn't just stay put. You had to take it. And certainly, any armchair strategist would be inclined to agree with Field Marshal Haig. And I don't suppose that my subscribers just fell off the turnip truck in terms of military strategy. You know that you can't just take the valleys and the plains and leave the heights to your opponent, otherwise they'll just rain shells down on you. And this fundamental principle of warfare was becoming increasingly evident to the British 48 hours into the operation. And so there was this realization that we have to take those damn heights. And I guess we should talk about the lay of the land a little bit. You know, if you're in Bourlon Wood and you look to the northwest, nestled right up against the tree line is Bourlon Village. And beyond that, just rolling plains heading down to the Canal du Nord that runs north and south, but that's not necessarily something I should have even mentioned because it's not a facet of our conversation here. So back to Bourlon Wood. Northwest is Bourlon Village. Now if we look the opposite direction, southeast, you're going to see Fontaine Notre Dame, or Fontaine Notre Dame. And while this village, comparable in size to Bourlon Village, is not nestled right up against the woods, it's certainly controlled by these heights in terms of, if you've got field pieces up in the heights, you control the village. Beyond Fontaine Notre Dame, you've got other villages, the St. Quentin Canal, on the other side of which you will find Cambrai. So that just to give you a general idea of how this area looks, short of showing you a map. And the Allied push is coming from the southwest towards this area. In fact, in terms of this game, they're coming from Ribecourt. And if you were to drive from Ribecourt to Bourlon Village, it'd be about 100 miles, just to put it into reference for you. Of course, in this game, you achieve that 100 miles in a rather short period, but I think that's just for gameplay's sake. So yeah, to conduct this attack coming from the southwest, you've got the 40th Division on the left, and they're aiming towards Bourlon Village and Bourlon Wood. And on the right, you've got the 51st Division, and they're aiming towards Fontaine Notre Dame. They're supported by D Battalion of the Tank Corps, and ultimately they'll also be supported by G Battalion. And in fact, the reason this whole Cambrai operation was selected for the tanks is that in this portion of the Western Front, the landscape is not pocked by all these craters, artillery craters, you see. It's rather conducive to massed tank assault. And as I mentioned in the last video, I mean, there's some 470 tanks involved in this. In fact, the entire British Tank Corps is involved. But in this particular attack on the heights at Bourlon, you've got those two battalions, D and G. And of course, G is, I mentioned that book, With the Tanks, with William Watson. He's from G Battalion. Anyhow, on 23 November, the 51st enters Fontaine with some tanks, but the Germans, they don't get dislodged, and so it's a bit of a quagmire. And the Germans up on the Bourlon Heights still pretty much control Fontaine. Meanwhile, the 40th, the battalion that goes into the woods, I mean, they fight for 4.5, 5 hours. And in the course of that fighting, they do end up controlling a majority of the woodlands. But again, the Germans are still there in large numbers by the end of the 23rd. And meanwhile, in the Bourlon Village, the other battalion of the 40th attacks the village and is countered. And a lot of historians will tell you that World War I doesn't consist of house-to-house fighting. But there's always an exception to the rule, and here the exception to the rule is Bourlon Village. Same can be said for Fontaine Notre Dame. There is indeed house-to-house fighting on the 23rd, and the same will occur on the 24th, and so on. And so let's move to the 24th. And meanwhile, the cavalry reserve has come up. You know, they're trying to augment these forces with the reserve, but most of the reserve, if not all of it, is cavalry. And of course, there's a reason for that. And that is this. I mentioned in the last video that the ultimate goal is Cambrai. But there should be a caveat to that. And it's kind of like the notion being that you're going to break the Hindenburg line, ideally, which in fact they do. And then your reserve are going to pour through. Well, here the idea is your reserve is cavalry. And the cavalry is going to do what cavalry has always done in the history of warfare. It's going to get behind enemy lines and disrupt supply. It's going to conduct raids on villages. And in this case, in this modern sense, it's going to tear up railroads. So that's why your reserve is cavalry. And again, a lot of people look at that in hindsight and say it was insufficient. But, you know, the reason it was there was because you were going to bust the Hindenburg line and you wanted them to pour through and just kind of raise hell behind enemy lines. Now, of course, your attack is stalled out, and now you need the cavalry to augment your fighting force. And so they're not going to really fight like mounted cavalry. They're in fact going to fight as dismounted cavalry or highly mobile infantry. And so indeed a regiment has been dispatched to Bourlon Wood by the 24th. And on the 24th, the Germans they counterattack with 3 4 times throughout the day. The last attack, the 4th one, is in the evening. And meanwhile, the Allies push again for the village of Bourlon. And they actually take the village more or less on the 24th. Now come the 25th, the enemy retakes the village of Bourlon. In that fighting, there's a little situation where the East Surrey Regiment is cut off from the rest of the 40th, but it's temporary. By the end of the day, they link back up with them, but it's kind of like a mini lost battalion kind of situation. 26 is more of the same, and every time that the Germans are countering, they're using high explosives and gas. They're able to fire down on Fontaine Notre Dame. It's just devastating combat, and in some cases very intimate combat, you know, close quarters. But the gas in itself, I mean, for instance, in one British regiment, I can't recall which regiment it was, but it went in with like 500 guys, and most of them succumbed to gas. Only 70 of them ended up walking out of Bourlon Wood. So let's skip the 26th and go up to the 27th. The Allies take Fontaine. The 62nd Regiment comes in and takes Bourlon. But then by the end of the day, the Germans counterattack, and they recapture both Fontaine and Bourlon. And all of this is ahead of the November 30th massive German counterattack, which is going to retake all of this, you know? And that attack, I mean, it's utilizing stormtrooper tactics, the likes of which you're not going to see until until the spring offensives, the Kaiserschlacht. This is a petri dish for the Germans just as much as it is a testing ground for the Allies. Now, both sides will refine their tactics by 1918. But prior to perfecting these tactics in 1918 comes their unveiling at the First Battle of Cambrai. It isn't necessarily the mass tank assault. Tanks have been utilized prior, but it's this combined arms, this all-armed assault that broke the back of the Hindenburg Line, an unprecedented feat, and the effect that this had on morale can't be overstated. And I don't just mean in the army, I mean on the home front. Church bells ringing across the British Isles, headlines reading Haig through the Hindenburg Line. One has to bear in mind that the British are just off the heels of the Third Battle of Ypres, what they refer to as Passchendaele. And if you want to talk quagmire, that was it. It's not covered in Battlefield 1, but it's a hallmark engagement of the First World War. And frankly, it's a whole can of worms. It's worthy of an entire episode or more, but not necessarily this episode.
According to the map, we should soon be out of these sodden woods. We need to get across this here bridge.
Needless to say, though, it had a profound effect. Oh, well, that came out of nowhere. Well, it came from the other side of the bridge, but considering the fog, it was apparently out of nowhere. And so Edwards will take on the responsibility of an entire platoon, cross this dry ravine, and engage whatever's on the other side. But, whatever boost in morale the British received from the successes of the 20th, 21st, and 22nd, it was certainly undercut, if not reversed, from the counteroffensive launched on the 30th. I mentioned that the city of Cambrai, it was a railway hub, and the Germans were using that throughout this battle to bring up fresh divisions, which they stockpiled in reserve in anticipation of their counteroffensive. Oh yeah, we're taking the sniper rifle here. But the German counteroffensive, it was massive. It started off in the south, not in the sector that contained Bourlon. God, those are some fortifications ahead. But when it came to the northern sector, the northern counterattack, it was even larger than the southern. It was about 2 hours later, precipitated by massive artillery bombardment. Both attacks utilized stormtrooper tactics, which were new to the Allies. Hadn't seen that before. And the result was routes, retrogrades, rear guards, and a slew of other R-words. Renault tank. They've got a Renault. Okay, so the Germans have a tank, and this should make things interesting. Another R-word that I failed to mention was Richthofen, the Red Baron. He brought his flying circus to the battle as well. And that's not just me joking, that's really what they called his squadron, was the flying circus. And you know, the Allies, they were rather good using their air power, the Royal Flying Corps or whatever, as to conduct reconnaissance, aerial bombing, air-to-air combat, of course. But the Germans, is that not occupied? Because if that's an empty tank, we want it. I mean, we gotta get it. What was I saying? Richthofen. The Germans, they were exceedingly proficient at air-to-land combat. So, I mean, I'm talking about strafing columns of men, strafing trenches, positions, whatever. In fact, I read one war diary, well, no, not a war diary, but it was a personal memoir of the war, where one of the troops near Bourlon, and I can't recall the name, I prefer to cite this stuff, but I can't do that if I can't remember his name. But he talks about, oh man, Count von Binoculars spotted me, and he's on his way. I'm afraid this particular boss wants to get between us and our tank. Our God-given tank, and I can't have that. But yeah, this soldier I was talking about, he describes in very graphic terms the effects of a strafing run from a Fokker triplane on the troops in his immediate vicinity. And it's one of those graphic accounts that just kind of sticks with you. And it's something when you compare that to an account, an after-action report or whatever, written by a senior officer that reads a lot like a textbook and is anything but memorable. In fact, it kind of strikes me how, when it comes to senior officers, they can write about a military defeat in such optimistic terms, whereas the individual soldier in the field can write about what most people would consider an overwhelming victory in a very sobering, if not horrific, light. But I suppose that's just symptomatic of their position in the military. I don't know. Now, most people look at the Battle of Cambrai, the first Battle of Cambrai, as a defeat. In fact, I guess it's unanimous. The Third Army failed to meet its stated goals. Granted, there were some achievements, but the Germans definitely won that battle. Nonetheless, when you read Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig's after-action report, it's strikingly optimistic. And I suppose he's submitted it to Prime Minister Lloyd George, or maybe just to the public at large, but I do have an excerpt from it, and I'll share that with you. I quote,
"The material results of the 3 weeks fighting described above can be stated in general terms very shortly. But had captured and retained in our possession over 12,000 yards of the former German front line, from La Valkyrie to a point opposite Bourlon, together with between 10,000 and 11,000 yards of the Hindenburg Line and Hindenburg Reserve Line, and the villages of Ribecourt, Flaquières, and Havrincourt. Total of 145 German guns were taken or destroyed by us in the course of the operations. 11,100 German prisoners were captured. On the other hand, the enemy had occupied an unimportant section of our front line between Vendoux and Gautier. There is little doubt that our operations were of considerable indirect assistance to the Allied forces in Italy. Large demands were made upon the available German reserves at a time when a great concentration of German divisions was still being maintained in Flanders. There is evidence that German divisions intended for the Italian theater were diverted to the Cambrai front, and it is probable that the further concentration of German forces against Italy was suspended for at least 2 weeks, at a most critical period, when our allies were making their first stand on the Piave line.
End quote. You know, he doesn't, throughout his entire report, talk a whole lot about the missteps he made. But he does mention how this battle on the Western Front could have had a potential positive impact on the Italian front. And yet I think about that soldier that's describing his friends being killed by a Maxim machine gun attached to a Fokker triplane. I think about a battalion that went into the Bourlon Wood, 500 strong, and came out only 70 strong. I think about troops that were gassed, blinded. The only way they could find their way out of the wood was clutching onto the man in front of them. I think about a company of the 17th Battalion Royal Fusiliers. And when they were ordered to withdraw, their company commander, a captain, he told most of his men to go, and he fought a rearguard action with 2, maybe 3 platoons. And when the Hun horde reached them, they were all killed. When Haig ordered his withdrawal, and it might have been the right thing to do, some of the regiments swore that they could have held the position in which they were standing, but instead, of course, they had to withdraw. The first Cambrai, it was a defeat for the Allies. And instead of talking about missteps, Field Marshal Haig's talking about Italy? Haig's talking about Italy? Just strikes me as strange. But I guess you gotta find the silver lining? I don't know. And I have nothing but respect for Sir Douglas Haig. But it's just one of those after-action reports that kind of rubs me the wrong way. Anyhow, I digress. I'm Automatic for Automatic Games. If you like this, like this. And thanks for watching. I will talk to you soon, friends. Dude is seriously talking about Italy.